Welcome, everyone. It's good to have you, and it's good to be here for another Global Kingdom Conversation. We have some real good times on this discussion. We'd like to also acknowledge the presence of our invisible audience that listen to us through YouTube. It's great to have you all aboard, and that family is continuing to grow. And as you continue to keep and remain having your interest here in what is being discussed. I'm grateful that we have Anderson Williams with us. Always grateful to have Andy. I want to engage with him a little bit before we get started. Andy, good morning to you. Well, it's morning here in LA, but it's probably afternoon, early afternoon where you are.
Yeah. It's one after 1 in the afternoon where I am. Yes. So yes, all is well then. Well, good evening to everyone, or good morning to everyone on the call.
Yes. Andy, I know you have been around a while and you've seen the landscape of church where it has arrived now, when you originally came to the Lord and how things were going then. Is there any hope you have for the future of the church? When you look on the landscape, when you look on the horizon, what do you see that is hopeful about what God is maybe showing you or telling you about the future of the dismal things that we see inside the institution and what is on the other side of that?
I'll start by saying that, listen, once God has his hand upon an initiative, there's always an enormous amount of hope. And I'm not blinded by the smoke screen. The smoke screen would be the prevailing distortions, the extremes, the abuses, the dysfunctionality. I'm not in any which way deceived by that, because the truth is that whenever there is an initiative of God in the earth, the opposite runs parallel to every true initiative of God. While Moses was trying to deliver Israel out of Egypt, and Aaron and Moses arrived in Egypt with all of the appropriate empowering, the counterfeit was able to produce a great deal of what Moses and Aaron had come to show as a mark of God's authority. And so the counterfeit always runs parallel to the authentic, and that's a fundamental principle. The danger is we sometimes get blinded by the counterfeit, or we sometimes assume that the counterfeit is the authentic. I am not so misguided in any which way. And I think the reason why I have this overwhelming sense of hope, it is because I could see through the smoke screen. And not only can I see through the smoke screen, but there is sufficient truth in the word of God that speaks of a remnant, that God will preserve a remnant. And despite all of the extremities and abuses, there is a body of people who are holding to the truth, who are committed to the truth, and who are piloting their way forward with an overwhelming sense of clarity, adherence to God, deference to his rules, and not holding to any cultural ideals, whether it be religious culture, whether it be national culture, whether it be historical culture. I know that there is a people like that in the earth. I've stumbled into them from time to time. I have committed myself to build relationships with people like those. We've prayed for people like that over the years, long before platforms like these were started. One of the things that we used to pray for, a colleague and I used to meet quite regularly, and we would pray consistently that God will connect us with those persons who are sincere. The term that I used to use is a term I call sincere seekers, those who are very sincere and who are not concerned about the branding and the madness and the foolishness, which I will describe as the counterfeit expressions. And so God has been responding to that in some of the most remarkable ways. I get calls out of the blue. People find me. I don't know how, whether it be on Twitter, they locate me, and all kinds of dynamic relationships are being forged and being built. But at the end of the day, I don't want to define my hope in what God is doing simply because of what I am involved in, or what level of sight I personally have, because I still know that my sight is still limited to the broad scope and the broad vista that God is really building and doing. But from my small angle of sight, there is enormous hope. But the more I connect with people who are seeing where they see, is the more my small sight enlarges and their small sight equally enlarges. And so that kind of collaboration and interfacing and the dynamic relational frameworks that are being built will allow us to really take this purpose of God massively forward. It's not it's not a move that is populated by individuals who are looking for prestige. It's not an initiative that is being piloted by individuals who are trying to stand on their own soapbox. This is a different dynamic altogether. It is driven by humility. It is driven by sincerity and brokenness. And the interesting thing is that most of the people that I would have interacted with globally, I'm talking about from New Zealand to the farthest corners of Fiji and everywhere else, what I have discovered is that they all seem to have one critical marker, the element of brokenness. And whatever circumstances, whether they found themselves in situations or whether life just seemed to hit them in a particular manner, I have discovered that almost every major player in the earth that I have interfaced with, they carry that one little mark, the element of absolute brokenness, almost like contrition, which is almost like another dimension of brokenness. Contrition is how you have your woman's powder, where the thing has been so pulverized, it's hard to cake it together to form a whole. And that's how I have seen most persons. Their lives are so broken, and it's not shattered in a way that it does not make sense. It's just that they have such an overwhelming dependence on God because they've been, for want of another word, they've been mistreated by the system. They've been abused by the system. They've been left for dead by the system. And those kind of people are the ones that I have run into over the years, and I find it remarkably hopeful. Yeah, Kevin. Yep.
Andy, you bring up this thing about brokenness, and I tell you, I know in my own personal process right now is I described it to Brenda as a kind of an emotional nauseousness. It's like what would happen to your stomach is happening to my inner being. And what I mean by that is that there is a cry. There's something about, and I can really relate to what you're saying about those in Fiji and the parts of the world that there is a brokenness. I'm really, really for that, because what I've noticed, Andy, is how easy it is to drift. How easy it is to drift. You know, people don't abruptly change typically, but the deception of the drift, I think, is very, very important. You could be laying on a boat and, you know, just kind of kicking back and close your eyes and got your shades on. And man, I'm telling you, if you're not careful, you will find that you're so far away from the shore, maybe even further than you wanted to be. And so this issue of drifting, where one page at a time is turned on a very thick book, and it doesn't seem like much is being changed, but I'm just saying that I just feel God calling me in that direction, Andy. I really, really do. And it's a very good thing. And it's comprehensive. It's not coming in a punitive manner. It's coming as a result of hunger, like a deep hunger. It's like when you're really, really thirsty and someone hands you a soda or hands you something else, it doesn't really quench the thirst. It may be something cold to drink, but this thirst has to do with the water. It has to do with the thing that is really, really calling for out of my inner being. And I tell you, I get tired of the Zoom calls and this and that and all this. It's great for us to meet. Don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is we can talk and we can dissect and we can go over concepts and we can dance ideas inside of our minds. But man, I'm telling you, this issue of brokenness, this issue of brokenness, and these broken people, like you said, not beyond repair, but they're broken for God. They realize that, man, I'm not going to go any further, and I don't want to go any further unless, like Moses says, you go with me, you go before me. And I really feel that there has to be a return back to that place of, you know what? I don't even know. I thank God for experiences, but I don't even know. I thank God for this and that, but I don't even know. And I'm saying that's a position before God, not before. Yeah. So, so Andy, while we're waiting, and again, I don't want to look at this waiting like we're twiddling our thumbs, but for these people who are kind of like sprinkled all over the earth, that have this same hunger and this same thirst inside of them, what is your advice for as we wait, as we, you know, what happens until this expression of God is really manifested to us? What would you suggest as being waiters of this move of God, of what we see?
Listen, man, at the expense of sounding a little bit kind of hyper spiritual, there's no magic bullet for us in this particular, I'm going to use your language, for us in this holding pattern, for want of another word. There's no magic bullet. At this phase, it really comes down to having your current blurred sight become clearer. Because as I said earlier, most of the persons I've interacted with, they have a certain level of sight, but a certain quality of heart. But my sight is incomplete without theirs. And so what I think is critically important is for every person who occupies that place where they are seeing, but their hearts are consistently pure and noble, then one of the first things that I would strongly recommend is, you know what, just allow your sight to be a little bit more clear. Adjust your sight correctly and know what should be the in focus area versus what should be the bokeh. Now, bokeh is a term that's used to describe the parts of a photo that ought to be blurred. So if you take a photo, you need to know exactly which part ought to be the focused area and which parts of it are allowed to be blurred. And I think that is an important part of those of us who are seeing and hearing, that we need to crystallize, make our sight even more clear. But in terms of clarity of sight, we need to know what ought to be in focus and what need to be bokeh. The other thing is at the end of the day, it's just a matter of apprehending God even more radically and more sincerely. Even before we talk about forging relationships and engaging in divine connections, etc., you need to embrace God even more radically. Now, let me kind of circle back to that issue of brokenness I mentioned earlier, because let me tell you one of the strong components that I have discovered more and more for me, and this may sound contradictory, but I have found myself relying a greater degree on God and placing a lot less confidence in the arms of the flesh. And it sounds contradictory simply because we need to forge relationships. We need to get close to our brothers and sisters. But I have found that for me, and I guess it could be a season that I'm walking through, that I have found that while I respect relationships and I am committed to it, I have found over the last couple seasons just the need to be more silent in my relationship with others and a lot more vocal in my relationship with God. It's as if like I have found the need to be less dependent on others and become more dependent on God.
Keyword.
And that is hard to describe, but it really speaks into certain dimensions that God is shaping and forming inside of me. And that has nothing to do with hurts and betrayals, of which there were many. My position is just that the way in which God has somewhat cornered me at this stage I find myself becoming a lot more loud in my engagement with him and a lot more silent with my engagement with others. I mean, I've always been very careful in how I speak to people and how I engage them. I've always been one who held information close to my chest. But I found myself becoming a lot more like that, a lot more like that of late. And it's all part of how God is trying to and working on processing me in private, because I am only good in a team if I am perfected as an individual. The omelet is only as good as the egg. That means that the more I could bring a perfected me or the best version of myself into any relationship, is the better it is for that relational framework altogether. And so that is where my focus has been, and that is what I will recommend for anyone who has found themselves in that holding pattern as God wants to switch and activate certain things. Don't be too quick to jump and depend on the brute force of your flesh. Wait a little bit. Don't be too quick to jump. Having heard is no authorization to act. Having seen is no allowance to do. Very often, God will prefer you kind of hold back a little bit more. I mean, he took Moses 40 years back in the wilderness before he switched Moses back on to go into Egypt. And so even a guy like not Daniel, David, when Samuel came and said, "This day you'll be king in Israel," this day didn't happen until many, many years after. And so in prophetic language, don't assume today in God is like within the next 24 hours. There are times you just need to wait and allow God to process you in private. And the day will come when he will more or less switch the lever and activate stuff way beyond what you could ever dream or imagine. Yep.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Waiting on God is really, really a skill, I think, because, man, I'm telling you, you can wait in complaining, you can wait in anxiety, you can wait, being whatever, kind of go through all those kind of changes. But the quality of waiting, I think something it says in Lamentations, it is good that one should both hope and quietly wait. Lord. And so that quality of quietly waiting, if I am complying externally and not complying internally, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. People look at me, oh, look at how obedient Kelvin is. Look at how he just loves the Lord. And inside, man, I'm telling you, is someone who's quite the opposite. So
Yeah.
I love what you said, Andy, about the whole thing about talking. Go ahead.
Let me make that other comment, because when you talk about waiting, people assume that waiting is passivity, is like spiritual passivity. Waiting is not a matter of what you do at a red light, where you just kind of sit there. But waiting has a certain level of animated readiness. It is the way I would describe waiting. If you ever heard Handel's Messiah or classical music and even current music, there are times when music hits a crescendo and there's a pause, and the pause that does not mean the completion of the music. You know that there's something coming next. And that waiting is almost like it's like lightning
Anticipation
with the knowledge. It's like lightning with the knowledge that thunder is about to come. And so you almost anticipate something is going to happen, and you are standing in readiness for that thing to come. And so we sometimes hear words like waiting on God, and we assume it is spiritual passivity. It is not. It is highly animated, highly energized, much anticipation. It is like tiptoeing and peering into the next stream of God's doing with deep anticipation, as well as readying yourself to act and move in a moment's notice.
Yeah. And having that expectation for him.
Right.
For him, not things or people or events, but having that expectation for him. And Andy, I tell you, man, I really love this. I think that these conversations need to be had more and more, because sometimes if I'm carrying something heavy, I need to make sure my legs are strong. I need to make sure that the foundation will be able to bear the weight of what I'm receiving. And so sometimes it behooves us to kind of go back and refortify the correct foundations for our lives. We can be able to bear the things that even that are coming our direction. I mean, I really feel that there'll be some who will have a course change of direction with their professional lives and things that they never would have anticipated. People will start businesses they never would have saw themselves as business people. That there has to be a preparation of heart for that kind of a thing. And so, I mean, these are exciting times. These are really, really exciting times. And speaking of anticipation, I'm really anticipating what you want to share with us today, Andy.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen and then we're gonna jump into this.
Sounds good.
We are good. We good to go?
Good to go.
Good to go. What does that? Continue to share, stop sharing, keynote. Okay. All right, guys. I want to kind of take my time, and sometimes you have sessions like these and you really wish if you had more time, number one, and that you had a more dynamic, kind of highly intense exchange and dialogue. And I wish if we could do that today. I wish if I could break this session up into small parts, and at the end of every small part, we open up for some interaction and hear what you're hearing, peer into how you are understanding it. And so what I want to do today, I want to let me kind of move this. I think this thing is behaving badly. Okay. I want to do today, I want to kind of look into more of the Great Kingdom Divergence, but I want to specifically speak today on the whole issue of breaking religious bureaucracy and empowering the masses. Now, the way in which I would describe this is almost like trying to look at some of the principles associated with what we have traditionally called a saints movement. But while we would have used the terminology, I don't think that much has been done in terms of how do we make that jump and begin to truly empower and activate the masses. And I'm using language deliberately, masses, and I'm saying that deliberately. And I'm equally describing religious bureaucracy. And I'm going to describe religious bureaucracy in just a little bit. But for those of us who are living outside of former British colonies, the concept of bureaucracy might be a little bit alien to you. But for those of us who would have in some way, some shape or form, maybe you would have interfaced with British bureaucracy, or you would have interfaced with the civil service system that has been handed down to some of these colonies in the days of colonialism, you would really understand how dangerous and toxic bureaucracy is in terms of a management component. And so when I talk about breaking the religious bureaucracy and empowering and activating the masses, I want to start first of all by going back, because remember, in us talking about the Great Kingdom Divergence, we're really looking at patterns inside of Europe. And I kept saying before, I've said before, that the patterns in Europe are not absolute. They are not the absolute best models, but it at least gives us a window that we could spy into and discover principles. And so let me go back to just one concept inside of the Great European Divergence, and one principle that led to Europe taking on a new sense of responsibility inside of the global economy. Now, here is the principle. During the French Revolution, and this happened between May of 1789 to November of 1799, during that entire period, the masses from the Third Estate, and the term Third Estate is the term from which you understand the Third World, because Third World was never used in those days to describe the global South. But Third World represented the mass of ordinary citizens. In France at that time, the First Estate would have been the noblemen. So if you were a king, you were a queen, you operated within the courts of King Louis XVI, then you were part of the First Estate. The Second Estate really were members of the clergy. So you're a pastor, you're a priest, you are in some level of functionality within the orbit of the church, then you were deemed the second estate. The third estate would have been just the mass of ordinary humanity, just the crowd of the underlings, the unimportant. They were called the third estate. And so economists use the very same concept to apply that to the third world. A bunch of insignificant, unimportant individuals struggling to find themselves and just trying to see their ends met, etc. But in France, during the French Revolution, the masses of the third estate, I took some time to describe third estate for you to understand where we're going. The masses of the third estate, those who we describe as ordinary citizens, and there's a nice word, pariahs, not pariah, P-A-R-I-A-H, but this is a Hindu term, pariah, which describes the lowest caste. So if you were living in France at the time, you were deemed as a pariah in terms of the lowest class, the Hindu term that describes the lowest, most insignificant caste within their whole arrangement. And so those people rose up in protest against the elite, which would have been the king and the queen, and they insisted on a new constitution for the king and the queen, who at that time were described as absolute monarchs. They were the absolute, meaning that they had their hands in everything. They made decisions for everything. Nothing happened in France without their approval. They were involved in every single aspect of life, and they were the ones who made the rules and the laws. That's absolute monarchy. And so the mass of the French population, the underclass of France, rose up and insisted on a new constitution where the absolute authority will no longer continue to use or to wield their power the way they did. Now, how they did that, it will be too long a conversation, but suffice it to say that they were helped along, and one of the voices that really provoked and inspired them was a guy called Maximilian Robespierre. And that was the guy who actually coined the term equality, fraternity, legality. I mean, that stuff that shaped the French Revolution. And so these people rose up in protest. Their protest resulted in a new way of politics, a new social reform across France, and the reinvention of citizenship. Now, that's a really important concept. And if any one of you is a lover of history, I would strongly recommend that you get a hold of books like The French Revolution and The Birth of Citizenship. Because in those days, what happened is that these underlings, the third estate, they made up 98% of the population. The 2%, the elites only made up the 2%. But what happened in any decision making, even though the 98% will outnumber the 2%, the 98%'s voice was never really considered to be legitimate. So let's assume, just a basic example, that we have to make a decision to buy a new window for the house. The 98% rise up and they said, well, we want a blue window. The 2% says, we want a white window. In that situation, the 2% basically got the vote. And so when this entire third estate rose up in protest, for the first time, citizenship took on a brand new meaning across France, because now my voice can be heard. Now I could contribute. Now I can vote, and my vote is considered legitimate. I'm no longer just an abstract voice in the midst of a multitude. Now you need to hear this and understand this, because I'm using this as a starting point to get into other issues. So let me repeat this. During the French Revolution, the masses, and that's an important word, the masses of the third estate, this would be ordinary citizens and pariahs. Remember, those of you who can't see the word written there, I'm not describing the English word pariah. I'm describing a Hindu word that describes the lowest of caste. Those people rose up and insisted on a new constitution for the then absolute monarchy. That constitution and the overall revolution in France paved the way for political and social reform and the reinvention of citizenship. Very important point. Now, absolute monarchy is what we would describe as autocracy on steroids. And so what happened in France at that time was this shift from absolute monarchy to popular sovereignty. Now, we won't get into all the historical and international relations aspects of that, not important. But again, the masses rose up and insisted on a change. Now, hear me. Now, not everyone across Europe welcomed that change. I mean, the truth is that the king and queen in France didn't have a choice at this point because their heads were cut off, and the whole royalty and monarchy in France came to an abrupt and immediate end. But other kings across Europe, they did not welcome this whole exercise. So some of these absolute kings across Europe resisted the new parliamentary system because it was seen as the cancellation of their power over the people, and they also saw it as limited access to the national cash register. Now, does that sound anyway familiar to where most churches are at today? Let me kind of pull out a couple of parallels. The absolute monarchy is being represented in the way in which most pastors conduct themselves. Autocracy on steroids. The masses that rose up in protest really are the members who sit there week after week, just going through the rhythm and the motion, hamster wheeling, as I've always said it. Not until the masses are empowered will we have real reform. Let me say that again. Not until the masses are empowered will we have real reform. Not until the masses move from membership to citizenship will we have real reform. And so across France, these were some of the basic things that they had to consider in order to bring about change inside of a system that was now in desperate need of change. I mean, when you think about what led to the masses rising up, because you're talking about a system where the king and the queen enjoyed, I mean, lavish, extreme lavishness that you could ever possibly imagine. Every single event in Versailles was welcomed with a lavish, expensive ceremony. So if you are the king and you getting out of bed, there was an expensive ceremony. If you are going to the bathroom, an extensive ceremony. I mean, I'm talking about in every which way. It was just extensive and extreme, while the people were suffering. And not only suffering, but they are the ones who are buttressing and supporting the lavishness of the king and the queen. I mean, they were doing this stuff to the maddest and most obscene levels. And that is when the people said, we can't take this anymore. Now, let me quickly segue away from this and bring this right back to where we ought to be. And to that, I'm going to start with a scripture we all know. This is Ephesians chapter 4, 9 to 13. And follow me today, as you always do. And I really appreciate the fact that most of you really stay close to these messages. Ephesians 4, I'm quoting from the Mirror Bible, verse 9, and listen. The fact that he ascended confirms his victorious descent into the deepest pits of human despair. He now occupies the ultimate rank of authority from the lowest regions of our darkness into which he stooped down in order to rescue us to the highest authorities in the heavens, having executed his mission to the full. What God has in us is gift wrapped to the world. Some are commissioned to pioneers. Others are gifted prophetically. Some are announcers of good news. Some are shepherds with a real gift to care and nurture. And others have a gift to ignite instructions through revelation knowledge. Verse 12, each expression of his gift is to fully equip and enable the saints for the work of the ministry so that they may mutually contribute in their specific function to give definition to the visible body of Christ. The purpose of these ministry gifts is to present everyone on par and in oneness of faith, believing exactly what the Son of God believes and knowing accurately what he knows concerning us, standing face to face in equal stature to the measure of the completeness of Christ. Now, you see those kind of stuff there, brother? I could read that over and over and just enjoy it and just kind of pull all of the nutrient value out of these verses. But for today, let me highlight this one part. Take note of this one part, because the emphasis is quite clear. Each expression of his gift is to fully equip and enable the saints for the work of the ministry so that they may mutually contribute in their specific function to give definition to the visible body of Christ. The purpose of these gifts is to present everyone on par and in oneness of faith. Now, the thing that I want you to understand is that the gifts are given not to showcase the apostle, not for the apostle to now change his title from brother to apostle. It is not for you to now print a call card where you have prophet. Good God, we have done that and it has not done anything. The objective of these gifts is to equip. Now, you see that word equip there? What most of us would have is to perfect. The word perfect is the word katatismo in the Greek language, and the word katatismo comes from the word artisan. And the idea is that you are working as a leader, a prophet, an apostle, as a skilled artisan to fashion an individual after an ordained blueprint. You are not doing this out of your head, because the concept in katatismo is that you are fashioning a thing after a very clear template. There is a template. So God has a template of what an empowered saint looks like. And you as a fivefold leader, you are called to bring and fashion and shape and bring this individual where they can stand as the complete representation of the prototype. Now, that is a big task. Now, the other thing I want you to realize is that all gifts have the same function. Now, that sounds a bit extreme, because if I were to ask you what is the role of the apostle, then you'll try to tell me about what the apostle does and what the prophet does. This is the point. Each of these gifts are given to fully equip and enable the saints. So what is the role of the pastor? His role is to fully equip and enable the saints. What is the role of the prophet? We think he's there to prophesy. No, he's there to fully equip and enable the saints for the work of the ministry. What is the role of the apostle? Not to travel around the world and build churches. No, to fully equip and enable the saints for the work of the ministry. Now, those are simple introductory comments, but let me build on that and make it clear. Now, the beneficiary of these gifts is not the ones grandstanding behind their pulpits with their titles and calling cards and gimmicks. Because the ultimate beneficiary, we think that, well, okay, I am an apostle, so I must be respected and revered. I'm a prophet, and so when I walk into a building, everyone must have a hushed tone because I could read your mail. And we have all of this gimmickry that is associated with these ministries. But listen, the beneficiary of these gifts is not the one grandstanding behind their pulpits. You calling yourself a prophet and celebrating your title, you miss the issue. The responsibility extends beyond you. The true beneficiary is not you. You see, the beneficiaries are the saints, the masses, as opposed to these religious bureaucrats who are very comfortable with the civil service model of managing God's affairs. Now, I'm going to say that again. The beneficiary happens to be the saints. God gave these gifts to perfect the saints. God gave these gifts in order to activate the saints. God gave these gifts not for you to put a new title to your name on a billboard. God gave these gifts to perfect the saints. The saints are the ones that God is after. The saints are the ones that God is concerned about here. The saints happens to be God's end point. The beneficiaries are the saints, the masses, not the religious bureaucrats who are comfortable with the civil service model of managing God's affair. What do I mean by the civil service model? A few hundred administrators cowing and controlling millions of followers, depending on three issues. They're depending on the miracle of management, which most of them are very skilled at, or some of them are very horrible at. And they are also depending on what I call lobotomized Christianity, people who just don't think, who seem not to have a brain of their own. And they are equally depending on human civility in order to avoid mass exodus. And that's the reason why most churches still continue to exist despite the abuses and extreme, because it's either the miracle of management to hold all these pieces together despite the dysfunctionality. It's the lobotomized Christianity, believers who will jump on the hamster wheel week after week without thinking, or we are not living in those days when we were barbarians. Now we are more civil. And so most of us would kind of want to wait on God on whether we should go to another church. And we have to hear what the Spirit says. And we become spiritually or religiously civil. And that is what is holding back the exodus or the hemorrhage. Hear me further. Now, most of what passes for church has become what I call the elitist model, that brings with it an inordinate obsession to ascribe celebrity and guru status to those we submit to. Now, I'm speaking the truth, and I'm sure you know it, that we have gotten to this place in Christianity where the moment someone begins to stand out as a representative of God, how quickly we want to put a garland on that person's neck and ascribe celebrity and guru status to these individuals. And that is not the order, that is not the pattern of God. Now, most leaders feed their own insecurities by exploiting that celebrity and guru status. Some of them, they love it, and they love basking in the glow of grandiosity that the system encourages. And some of them will gouge on the narcissistic juices that their sycophantic followers richly provide. People love this kind of stuff. People love being celebrated in their churches. Oh, how great a man of God you are. Oh, how wonderful a man of God. I'm so blessed. People love that kind of stuff. And the day you can just dispense of that, you will no longer be driven to pleasing people, but building the purpose of God more accurately. Most people love that kind of stuff. And in order for us to shift gears and begin to truly activate the masses and the saints, there has to be that internal switch inside of us where that kind of celebration no longer appeals to us. That level of guru status and celebrity status that people give, it no longer makes us warm in the inside. Something about it allows us to it kind of rolls off like water and ducks back. But some people love it. And in that place where they love it, they are flushed with an arrogant swagger. They have their entourage as they walk into their churches. They have armor bearers. I still don't understand all of these terminologies inside of these churches. Armor bearers, where you could hardly carry your own Bible to a pulpit because armor bearers have to relieve you, the man of God, of all this hard work that you have to do. And your wife now becomes first lady. She could no longer just be your wife. Now she's first lady. And these leaders have unfettered access to the corporate cash register and all the trimmings of royalty, very much like the absolute kings had in their day. As I said earlier, the absolute kings in France, everything that they did was welcomed by a ceremony, a lavish ceremony. In some of these churches, pastors love this stuff. On their birthday, there's a lavish ceremony for the pastor. On the pastor's appreciation week, lavish ceremony. His wife's birthday, lavish ceremony. His children's birthday. And they live in that world that looks no different from medieval absolutist kings inside of their artificial empires. Now, we have to break this model in order to switch on the next purpose of God. Now, listen, this esoteric, meaning bureaucratic, only a few at the top managing the affairs, this bureaucratic, esoteric, idolatrous brand of Christianity has produced several things. I'm going to walk through a list of some of the things that it has produced. The type where the leaders are absolute rulers, where they mimic the patterns of the absolute monarchies. That brand of Christianity has resulted in what I called, it has created a gilded faith. Gilded faith, meaning it looks only nice on the outside, but not very, once you get past the exterior, you realize it's not as grand as it looks. You go to some churches and you interact with some leaders, and they could sing a beautiful song about what they're doing, what they're building, and how wonderful their world is. And then you get past, you just hang around them for a little while, a couple of months, a couple of years, and you suddenly realize that it's all gilded, that the gold is a very thin veneer, and beyond that is this extravagant human condition that is completely unclean. This brand of Christianity has produced a church caste system where you still bracket people in little groups, the rich, the poor, the educated, the uneducated, and you pull on those who have a little money and you throw them into positions of power in order to kind of keep them quiet. That has produced a church caste system. It has allowed for an ever-widening gap between leaders and followers, and that's the Nicolaitan element there. That this thing, the more leaders are kind of basking in the glow of celebrity status, it is allowed for the widening gap between leaders and followers. It has spawned an environment of abuse, control, manipulation, and despotism. That's the brand of Christianity that this stuff has produced. More than that, it has produced what I call an inverse Ephesians 4 reality. I'm sure you heard me talk about inverse Ephesians 4, because the Ephesians 4 principle is leaders ought to perfect the saints. The inverse Ephesians 4 happens to be the saints perfecting their leaders, lavishing gifts and narcissism and all this sense of have to celebrate him and magnify him and lift him up, and preachers love that stuff and they accommodate it. What it also creates, it creates an environment where arrested development is the norm. Believers are either denied or they are ill-equipped to effectively participate in the amelioration of their communities. And so what happens very often is that we have this sense in which most of what happens, it caters to the leaders. Our current model caters to the leader. You go to most churches and the leader is almost celebrated as a god, when the true people, the masses, are left almost unattended and unaddressed. Now, this is where we have to make the shift. Now, here's an important principle. Most leaders are truly unmoved, and this is by my experience. Most leaders, I have found most leaders, despite all their preaching and everything else they do week after week, most leaders are unmoved by Christ's agenda and the urgent prodding of the Spirit. Very few have a genuine commitment to God's agenda. Most of them are no more than snake oil salespeople, fixated on building their empires, committed to hype and less committed to truth, sincerity, and authenticity. I'm hoping that none of you on this platform fall within this bracket. Whether you are listening on YouTube or wherever else, this is not where you live. That's the reason why you are on this conversation, because we don't subscribe to this model where we are no more than snake oil salespeople, fixated on building our little empires, and our vision becomes so grand and our call becomes so grand, and we living in a world of hype and branding and less committed to truth and sincerity and authenticity. These are the things that's holding back the mass movement. When I say mass movement, the saints movement. Now let's get to this. Now, the elitist brand of Christianity, that brand cannot achieve the Christ agenda. And this brings me now to describing what I mean by a saints movement. What does it look like? So we took some time and we described a little of the extremities associated with leaders who are celebrated a little bit too much. I mean, respect them. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Honor them. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Value them. I'm not saying you shouldn't. All of that should be good, proper kingdom attitude. I'm not saying that you must be dismissive and insulting and pay no attention to them, but you need to know your boundaries. Don't go to these extreme levels that happens in most of our churches today. But that elite brand of Christianity cannot achieve the purpose of God because it is too fixated on the leader and not fixated on the masses and the saints. This is what must happen. We must move power to the hand of the masses. And that's what conversations like these are designed to do. What does the saint movement look like? What does it look like? How do we activate the saints in order to take the lead and begin to truly fulfill what God has called them to do. When I say take the lead, I'm not talking about overthrowing and killing the king and the queen. I'm talking about where they can involve themselves as citizens, where their 98% voice is no longer dismissed and ignored, where their only contribution is a tithe and an offering and maybe their seat on the pew. I'm talking about the saints are activated and switched on. And where do we need to go? Move power to the hand of the masses. Where do we need to go? We must be deliberate in terminating the prevailing Nicolaitan ethos that permeates today's Christianity. We know what Nicolaitanism is. It's the big gap between the clergy and the laity or the underlings. We have to be deliberate in removing and terminating that Nicolaitan ethos that permeates the current brand of Christianity. We must empower, activate, and mobilize the saints to full functionality. Now, please write these things down because they are very, very, very important. We have to activate the saints, must empower them, must mobilize the saints to full functionality. What does that look like? Empowering the masses results in what I call a spiritual blue zone, where the individual's call, purpose, and identity are never considered threatening, but it's considered sacred. Now, when I say blue zone, in the earth, there are different blue zones. Blue zones are zones that humanity has discovered as safe zones where people live a more buoyant life, they live a more fulfilled life, they live a more productive and a more protracted life. In a blue zone, people could live to 110 years old. And there are several blue zones in the earth, but I am describing a spiritual blue zone where life is more buoyant and fulfilling and satisfying. In this spiritual blue zone, leaders must treat the individual's call, purpose, and identity in God not as something that's threatening, but as something that is sacred. And so leaders must now respect, encourage, and provide room and opportunity for these individuals to give full vent to the call that God placed in them, not being threatened. Now, hear me well. I'm going to continue further. What do we mean by a saints movement? We must cancel the false and grandiose expectations that we often put on ministry leaders. This kind of guru and celebrity status we put on our leaders, not only do we put that on our leaders, but we also have these false and grandiose expectations. And if pastor put his hand upon my sick daughter, she'll be healed, but I don't want the deacon or my sister across the road to pray. We have these grandiose expectations. Now, I am in hospital and I'm sick, and if pastor only comes to pray for me, then I'll be well. I appreciate my sisters coming, but I prefer the pastor. You see, those false and grandiose expectations, we have to begin to make those shifts. We have to cancel those false and grandiose expectations that we often put on our ministry leaders. Next, we have to trust the work of the Holy Spirit in the hearts of the people. We have to trust the work of the Holy Spirit in the hearts of the people. Here's an important comment. God trusts us, and put yourself in this bracket. God trusts me to take his purpose forward despite my many frailties. Why do I expect perfection from the saints before I release them? I put release them in bracket because that's the language of manipulative leaders. I won't release you. I won't release you. But God trusted you and released you despite your imperfections. But now we suddenly assume that because we are the head honcho, we determine what perfection looks like according to our definition. God trusts us to take his purpose forward. But we can't trust a few members in front of our church because what we want is control. You are less concerned about release, you are more concerned about control. If we talk about the saints movement, what does it look like? We cannot be blinded by our empire building fixation. We cannot be blinded by our ministry, our call, our vision, because at the end of the day, your vision must include the purpose of God inside of the hearts of the people. We cannot be blinded by our empire building fixation, that we cannot see the purpose of the Lord unless we see it through our own agenda. And that's what distorts this thing, because we get so fixated with what we want to do that your interpretation of the purpose of God must be seen through your agenda. And so someone comes and they present this idea to you that God is talking to me this way. And the first thing we do is to shut them down because it doesn't seem to fit my agenda. We cannot be blinded by our empire building fixation, that we cannot see the purpose of the Lord unless we see it through our own agenda. Listen to me. We have to truly empower people so that they can be Tetrised. Now that's a real word, and it comes out of the very game called Tetris, where people pluck into place. We have to truly empower people so that they can be Tetrised into God's mosaic and not the current pseudo empowerment designed for people to become loyalists to a brand. Now, let me say that again. When we empower people, what you want is for them to pluck inside of God's purpose. But in our current manipulative kind of world, empowerment comes at a cost. And what that cost look like? Empowering to imprison. And so I invest in you, now I own you. And so very often we don't empower an individual to discover God for themselves. What we do, we empower them to imprison them to ourselves. So since I invested 3 years in you, now I own you. And that's almost like the way some of these colonial centers treat a scholarship individual. So in some parts of the world, if you are a brilliant little scholar and I am the government and I say, okay, I'm going to pay for your education, but hear what? I'm paying for your education. Since I covered your tuition, you owe me 5 years of your life. And that's how some pastors operate. And so it is not empowerment so that an individual can Tetris themselves in God's purpose. But what you want is to build a system where that individual is tethered to you for life. This is not the order of correct empowerment. Now, walk through that list again, because inside of there, I'm describing some of the important issues that we have to consider if we have to build the masses and activate the individuals and empower the saints the way Ephesians describes it. Let me read it again. The elitist brand of Christianity cannot achieve God's agenda. What we must do, however, we must move power to the hand of the masses. We must be deliberate in terminating the prevailing Nicolaitan ethos that permeates today's Christianity. We must empower, we must activate, we must mobilize the saints to full functionality. And in doing that, create a spiritual blue zone where the individual's call, purpose, and identity, it's never considered threatening, but it's always seen as sacred. Therefore, we respect it, we encourage it, and we provide room and opportunity for it to express itself. We must cancel the false and grandiose expectations that we often put on ministry leaders. We have to trust the work of the Holy Spirit in the hearts of the people. God trusts me. Why can I not trust you? We cannot be blinded by our empire building fixation that we cannot see the purpose of God unless we see it through the lens of our own agenda. We have to truly empower people so that they can be Tetrised in God's design and God's plan, and not the current model of fathering, where it's a pseudo-empowerment model designed for people to become loyalists to your brand. That means you empower them, so now you imprison them. You invest in them, so now you own them. That's not the model. Now, let's go further. And for that, I want us to kind of switch gears a little bit. And this here is a serious conversation. And let's talk about this whole issue of what is described as the tower of the flock. I'm going to try to do this in 30 minutes, then open up for some interaction. Because all that I've just said, even though we could see patterns in Ephesians, let's see an Old Testament, almost like a parallel, an Old Testament parallel. And let's go back and read a couple of scriptures here. And read this. I'm quoting from the New Living Translation. This is Genesis 35. And if you're a leader here, take note of these concepts and start to be more deliberate in bringing people to the fullness of who they are called to be. Genesis 35, 1-7. Read this. Read this. Then God said to Jacob, get ready and move to Bethel and settle there. Build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob told everyone in his household, Get rid of all your pagan idols, purify yourselves, and put on clean clothing. We are now going to Bethel, where I will build an altar to the God who answered my prayers when I was in distress. He has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave Jacob all their pagan idols and earrings, and he buried them under the great tree near Shechem. And as they set out, a terror from God spread over the people in all the towns of their area. So no one attacked Jacob's family. Eventually, Jacob and his household arrived in Luz, also called Bethel, in Canaan. Jacob built an altar there and named the place El Bethel, which means the God of Bethel, because God had appeared to him there when he was fleeing from his brother Esau. Now, I want you to kind of follow the narrative here. And let me pull a few concepts out of it. Let me read some more, and then we're going to get to that. Look at verse 9, same scripture, Genesis 35, verse 9. Now that Jacob rather had returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again at Bethel and blessed him, saying, "Your name is Jacob, but you will not be called Jacob any longer, for now your name will be Israel." So God renamed him Israel. Then God said, "I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. You will become a great nation, even many nations. Kings will be among your descendants, and I will give you the land I once gave to Abram and Isaac. Yes, I will give it to you and your descendants after you." Then God went up from that place where he had spoken to Jacob. Jacob set up a stone pillar to mark the place where God had spoken to him. Then he poured wine over it as an offering to God and anointed the pillar with olive oil. And Jacob named the place Bethel, which means house of God, because God had spoken to him there. Now, there are several things you could pull out of there, and you could use the pattern of the house of God. Now, basic principles. Now, the house of God empowers and transforms you, because right there in Bethel, his name was changed from Jacob to Israel. There's a transformative process that ought to occur when you are in the house of God. I'm using images, but listen to me. In the house of God, you need to at least have a sight of God's mightiness and his grandeur. In Bethel, God says, "I am El Shaddai." In Bethel, God takes you back to your original covenant, your original mandate. Be fruitful and multiply. That ought to be the patterns in Bethel. In the house of God, God reaffirms his covenant towards you. "I will make you into a great nation." Those are very important patterns for house of God status. Now, let me identify a few more. Now, Bethel means the house of God. Very simple pattern. And so there is this urgent need for personal purity, sanctification, ridding yourself of your strange gods in order to engage in this critical movement that God is calling you into. And so the first thing that Jacob said, God is calling us to move, so get rid of all your strange gods. Every time you have to move, you have to know how to get rid of unnecessary baggage. And very often the baggages happen to be a bunch of strange gods that you pick up along the way. And that is a real point right there, because the strange gods that you pick up, they are defined as strange gods. It's idolatrous. And in your own movement, if you were to identify sacred cows that you picked up in your process, then that's a strange god that you have to get rid of as God prepares you for movement. The second point, very simple: obedience to God's command comes with the assurance of divine protection. So the more the people got rid of their gods, engaged in the process, God says that the nations and all the areas that they went through, they were protected and preserved. No one even rose up against them. And that is a reality. And this is something I've been talking about on other platforms, that we have to begin to engage God at a covenantal level. And when you begin to engage God at a covenantal level, it's a different kind of dialogue altogether. That world, in that realm, God offers this level of divine protection over Jacob and his entire household as they move. Now, arrival in Bethel comes with the recognition and revelation of the God of Bethel. Now, that's one of the most profound situations that happen right here. And why is it important for all of us on this call to see this? Because arrival in Bethel comes with a recognition and a revelation of the God of Bethel. The guy arrived in Bethel and built an altar, offered a sacrifice to El Bethel. What's the point? The point is, the moment you have sight of the bigger picture, your loyalty to the smaller system is diminished. In other words, most of us and most people could get so loyal to Bethel because they've not yet seen El Bethel. So you'll go to church and you jump on the hamster wheel. But the moment you get sight of the God of the house of God, then you have just seen the bigger picture. And the smaller system and your loyalty to the smaller system, it diminishes. Now, that is such an important point that I need for you to note, that the guy comes to Bethel and he has a revelation of the God of Bethel. Every time you see the patriarchs build an altar, it represents a moment of epiphany, a moment of sight. This is not religious activity. This is a moment of sight, a moment of revelation and clarity. So this guy has a sight of the God of Bethel. Let me say that again. The moment you have sight of the bigger picture, your loyalty to the smaller system is diminished. Now observe the next verse. It says, verse 16, leaving Bethel. You see, you don't leave until you see El Bethel, and that's an important point. You can't leave, and leaving does not necessarily imply your physical departure all the time, because some of you may have responsibilities in your organization that you have to fulfill and you have to do what you got to do. But sometimes your sight of God lifts you beyond the system. It takes you beyond the structures that you are loyal to. So the moment this guy offered a sacrifice, at that point, it's easy to leave. Leaving Bethel, Jacob and his clan moved towards Ephrath. But Rachel went into labor while there was still some distance away. Her labor pains were intense, and after a very hard delivery, the midwife finally exclaimed, "Don't be afraid, you have another son." Rachel was about to die, but with her last breath, she named the baby Benoni, which means the son of my sorrow. And the baby's father, however, called him Benjamin, which means the son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a stone monument over Rachel's grave, and it can be seen there to this day. Now, what I want you to realize now is that simple pattern. This guy goes from Bethel, discovers El Bethel, and moves. And this is the point I want you to get. For those of you who find yourself inside of this liminality zone, you are no longer in the system and you're trying to discover the next move. In that liminality zone, you need to get sight of God. That's important. But the other thing is this. This is the point you have to understand. There is life beyond the system. Leaving Bethel, he moved towards Ephrath. The word Ephrath basically was Bethlehem, which means the house of bread, the house of food. Don't ever think that the only place of your sustenance is in Bethel. Please understand this. Please don't think that the only place of your sustenance is Bethel. You can leave Bethel and find your way in Bethlehem where you can be well provided for. Let's go further. Let me explain. Leaving Bethel is important. Let me go further. This is an important point here. This is the point I want you to get here. Let me read this here. I don't think I read all of it, did I? Let me read it again. Leaving Bethel, that's the high point. Jacob and his clan moved towards Ephrath, but Rachel went into labor while there was still some distance away. Her labor pains were intense, and after a very hard delivery, the midwife finally exclaimed, "Don't be afraid, you have another son." Rachel was about to die, but with her last breath, she named the baby out of her own pain, out of her own sorrow, out of her debilitation. She said, "Son of my sorrow." But right there, Jacob rose up as a father, and he called his son Benjamin. Can you mute whoever is talking there? He called him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Benjamin. And Jacob set up a stone pillar over Rachel's grave, and it can be seen there this day. And this is the next point. Then Jacob traveled on and camped beyond Migdal Eder. Now, you see that term there, Migdal Eder? Write it down. Now, the 2 points I want you to get here. One is leaving Bethel. Leaving Bethel. There is something called leaving Bethel. And the image I got when I read that is like similar to when Jesus was walking away from the temple. Most of us are so loyal to the system that we don't even know how to leave. We've been imprisoned by it. We feel as though, well, we are almost disobeying God, that we are breaking his rules, that we are compromising his systems if we have to leave Bethel. But listen, only when you have a sight of God, I would encourage you, if you have not yet had that sight, stay where you are. Only with that sight of God, when this guy built an altar, he could comfortably leave. Now listen, there's food, sustenance, and life beyond the systems of Bethel. I discovered that. I used to be a part of an organization. I literally thought that, listen, beyond this, there's death. I really thought that. I thought, well, listen, I'm nothing else beyond this, because all my friends were there. Every single thing over the space of several years was built right there. And so walking out of that particular system, I had to enter into a world where initially I thought that, listen, I am alone, I'm abandoned, but this is a very important principle for any one of you who's imprisoned in whichever system you find yourself in. There is food, sustenance, and life beyond the system. The next point is, in Bethlehem, the place of bread, there is death of the old and birth of the new. In Bethlehem, even in this new place, his wife dies, and she gives birth to his other son, Benoni. But more than that, you're seeing what I call patriarchal power being activated in Jacob for the first time. All of Jacob's children were named by their mothers. All of his children were named by their mothers. But for the first time, Jacob takes the mantle. His wife is dying. He's in a new place in God. He's discovering God. And right there, he takes the mantle and he says, this one will not be named by the mother. I will name this child for myself. And he named him Benjamin. And for the first time in his operation, Jacob takes the patriarchal mantle. Beyond Bethlehem, there's this place called Migdal Eder. Take note of that word. Migdal Eder literally means the place of the flock, the place of the flock. So there's this simple little journey that we are seeing here. First of all, this guy is leaving, or rather God sends him to Bethel. He discovered the God of Bethel. He moves beyond Bethel and he finds himself in the place of bread. And the point is, please don't ever assume that your only place of bread is in the house of God. The moment you assume that, you are feeding and nurturing the very same system that shuts down the potential of God in so many other areas. He found himself in Bethlehem. And in there, he discovers new power, new patriarchal capabilities. And he moves further to a place called Migdal Eder. Let me read about Migdal Eder. And for that, I need to go to Micah chapter 4. Follow me. I hope that you are, because this will take us into another conversation that I will not get into another time. In Micah chapter 4, this is where Migdal Eder appears for a second time. But look at the context. And I'm going to read the context and hear me. But in the last days, it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it. Excuse me. And many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his path. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts hath spoken it. For all people will walk, everyone in the name of his God, and we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. Now, those are important scriptures. This is almost like repeated verbatim from things that Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 2. But it has all kinds of stuff there to unpack, but we can't do that today. To get into the issue of mountains and the significance of mountains and why God speaks of the mountain of the Lord's house being established on top of mountains, listen, it has all kinds of conversations there to speak into civilizations. This is not just mountain ranges, it's civilizations that's being superimposed upon by the grandeur and by the strength of another governmental power. But this is the thing I want us to get into. Let me read the other verse, the other part of it. In that day, verse 6, in that day when the mountain of the Lord's house is being established upon mountains and nations streaming to it, in that day, in that same day, when the government of God steps into this super dimension of prominence, when the government of God and the kingdom of God steps up to a brand new level, in that same day, says the Lord, will I assemble her that hateth, that halteth rather, and I will gather her that is driven out, and her that I have afflicted. And I will make her that halteth a remnant, and her that was cast far off a strong nation, and the Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever. And thou, O tower of the flock, and that's the same people we read about earlier, and thou, O Migdal Eder, and thou, O tower of the flock. So let's kind of read between this, right? So in the earlier part, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established upon the mountains, and nations will stream into it. The mountain of the Lord's house will assume super dominance and prominence, and nations will say, teach us your ways in that day, O thou tower of the flock. You who are designated the stronghold of the daughters of Zion, unto you shall it come, even the first dominion, and the kingdom shall come, and the kingdom shall come. Now, you see that latter part right there, that verse 8? That there is an important point. Very important point. Because you'll understand why there is this need for a saints movement. Because that tower of the flock is important. Let me describe it. Now, the reality of the house of God, assuming its prominence, that prominence, the mountain being established and nations streaming to it, the reality of the house of God, assuming that level of prominence, is dynamically linked to God's coming to the tower of the flock. Now, I hope that you see that connection. That prominence, the mountain of the Lord's house, we could quote that from now until the end of days. But what we are seeing in Micah is the technology to activate it. Because it won't be activated by prayer meetings. It won't be activated by us screaming very loud. It won't be activated by us becoming a Christian nationalistic organization where we want to take over the government. Now, this is a simple context in which it occurs. The reality of the house of God, assuming its prominence, is dynamically connected and linked to God's coming to the tower of the flock. Where's the tower of the flock? The tower of the flock, they said historically, it was the mother of Constantine, who under divine inspiration, whether it be a witch or whether it was the Holy Ghost, she discovered its exact location, which happened to be the very spot where Jesus was born. That's where it is. That tower of the flock, or Migdal Eder, it is the exact location where Jesus was born. And that's important because you realize that the King of Kings was not born in a palace. Because you understand, it has all kinds of stuff that Jesus is speaking to. And the King of Kings did not activate the establishment of his kingdom by looking for the most prominent. Jesus didn't go and look for occupants of the first and second estate. He went to the masses, the third estate. By now you understand the language. He went to the masses and found the down and out, those people that most of our churches will not even care to listen to. These were the ones that Jesus started with. And so the tower of the flock, Migdal Eder, its literal location is where Jesus was born. And those people who get into that, they talk a lot about the authenticity of Christmas and celebrating his birth and all this stuff because, the tower of the flock is real. But that is not the point. This was the place, the tower of the flock. The tower of the flock was a place where the sheep's strength the sheep's safety, and the sheep's readiness for sacrifice, those were the priorities. Now, if you only understand that, the tower of the flock is where the emphasis shifts back to the sheep, not to the shepherd. Now the shepherd has some adjustments to do, because let's face it, because it means that the sheep could never arrive at a place of strength and safety and readiness without your help. But this is where the tower of the flock is where the flock becomes the important output. This is the place where the sheep's strength, or the flock's strength, the flock's safety, and the flock's readiness for sacrifice, this is where it was a priority. Furthermore, the shepherds in Migdal Eder, and this is a historical thing, because the Talmud actually writes about this. The Talmud writes about this and said, all of the shepherds in Migdal Eder treated all of the flocks in the surrounding areas, even on the outskirts of the city, as sacred, consecrated, worthy to be offered to the Lord as a sacrifice. This entire city, this entire jurisdiction, this entire region was an area where the flock took on massive importance. Not until we shift gears and really begin to empower the saints the way Ephesians calls us to. Not until we give God the right to come to Migdal Eder, come and bring your strength and showcase your power. Come and reside there, oh, you Migdal Eder, tower of the flock. This is where the government basically asserts itself. And from this place, all of that Isaiah chapter 2 reality comes on, That's where it begins to take on a new level of traction. Listen to me. This is where the kingdom comes. This is where the priority of our building ought to be. And this is such an important point. This is where the priority of our building ought to be. Let me go back and just read this last verse here. In that day, now remember, the previous verse talks about the Isaiah chapter 2 verbatim. The mountain of the Lord's house will be established. These are scriptures we've been talking about for years. Well, how will we switch this on? Do we need to get men in the White House and get Christians in politics and they could take over our city council? And we got all of that. And then right there, in that day, all this stuff is going on and God is about to change the system. And verse 6, he says, in that day, says the Lord. Verse 8, O thou tower of the flock, O thou tower of the flock, you who give priority to the flock, and you're no longer concerned about you standing on your soapbox and bringing in your entourage and your wife is the first lady and all this crazy stuff. You tower of the flock, when you begin to treat every sheep as sacred, as consecrated, their concerns are important, their call is important. The stronghold, O thou tower of the flock, the stronghold of the daughters of Zion, unto you shall I come, shall it come, even the first dominion. The kingdom shall come to the daughters of Jerusalem. Right there, the tower of the flock. So I'm going to repeat this last slide and I'm going to stop and leave the rest of it for another time. The reality of the house of God, assuming its preeminence, is dynamically tethered to God's coming to the tower of the flock. This is where the sheep's strength, the sheep's safety, and the sheep's readiness for sacrifice were the priorities. The shepherds in Migdal Eder treated every flock, every last member of the flock, even those in the surrounding areas, scattered in the outskirts of the city. These shepherds treated every member of the flock as sacred, consecrated, worthy to be offered to the Lord as a Passover and peace sacrifice. This is where the kingdom comes. And this is where the priority of our building ought to be. Our next conversation, whenever that is, we will get to the mountain of the Lord's house and we'll explore what that looks like. For now, I'm going to stop. Kevin, I'm going to turn this meeting back into your capable care. Hope that we all heard. Yeah, Kevin.
Andy, I mean, At least let the mic cool down a little bit before you pass it back to me, but it's okay. It's okay. This is really good, man. What I want to comment on is that this sounds so exciting because it appears to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is your interpretation and what's come through you, is that this is God pastoring his people.
Right.
Even the gathering, all of this, he's initiating. So I don't see man inside of this. I could be wrong.
You're totally right. This is a God thing. It's an absolute God thing.
That's refreshing.
Absolute God thing. Yeah.
That's refreshing. So I'm gonna say one of the slides here I had to capture. I want to comment on this. Bethel, the house of God, the urgent need for personal holiness and ridding yourself of strange God is critical for movement and migration. So yeah, this is very, very, I mean, it looms large. The arrival in Bethel comes with a recognition and revelation of the God of Bethel. Man, I'm telling you, that's a place right there to just sit and settle and let God talk. You know, then with the name changes, God gave name changes, I believe, to give nature changes. There was a nature change inside of the new name. So these names are very significant. God just wasn't being entertaining. He was naming and giving these names for a real reason. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, whenever God begins to shift your name, he's actually shifting your nature, your personality, your mandate, your vision. And you see, so much about Jacob. Remember, Jacob's name literally means a supplanter. It literally describes a schemer, a scamp, someone who can't be trusted. But this guy has this enormous mission and mandate, but his personality, his nature, it contradicts, or rather it could bottleneck the mandate that God has upon his life. And so all of these experiences, the experience in Padan Aram, because there's a lot of good little principles you can get from Jacob, who was twisted. He would steal, listen, this guy would steal wind this guy would steal ice from an Eskimo. This guy is crooked to the core. But this is interesting, huh? That he goes down to Padan Aram, and his brother, or rather his uncle Laban, meets him for the first time and embraces him and says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Very often, change in your life begins when you see a mirror of yourself in somebody else and you don't like it. And so Laban was everything that Jacob was, but he was a different level. And Jacob made the dreaded mistake of falling in love with Laban's daughter. And you know the rest of the story. But all of that was important because the change process did not begin by God coming down from heaven and screaming in Jacob's ear. You know, Jacob's process began by seeing an image of himself in somebody else, being mistreated by somebody else, being lied to by somebody else, being outswindled by somebody else. And suddenly he said, is this me? This is me? If you realize even Jacob's wrestle with the angel in Mahanaim, that wrestling match, when the angel touched him and the angel says, what is your name? The Amplified Translation says, Jacob answered with shock and said, I'm a scamp. It was Jacob having a revelation of himself on that Mahanaim floor. This was not a revelation of God. It started with Jacob having a revelation of himself. Wow. The Amplified said he answered in shock and said, I am a scamp. I'm a schemer. I'm twisted. And that is the process that brought Jacob to this particular point here, because prior to this, Jacob had to depend on God to more or less meet his brother Esau, because he outswindled his brother's birthright and blessing. And now he has to meet Esau as a changed man. And how could you interact with Esau after having denied him what is his? And God had to meet him. And that is what God said to him, go back to the very place where I met you when you were running from your brother Esau. Because the experience you had there, you can't ignore it. You can't minimize it. I met you there. And that is where God said, I'm going to change your name now. Because you know what? You are beginning to show the evidence of a life that is no longer Jacob. Your Jacobness is no more. Now you're beginning to step into everything that Israel represents. Thus, the name change was more than just God basically having an adjustment to the birth paper of Jacob. This was God changing his nature and bringing it in alignment with his destiny.
This is incredible. Andy, you know, I mean, we just throw the word powerful around like confetti, but this really is powerful because it's revelational, because the revelation of yourself. And it's very difficult, particularly for leaders who, you know, you're thinking about calling yourself a scoundrel. And it's like, man, do you know how many souls I won this year? Do you know how many people I led to the Lord? Do you know how many, you know, and then we start thinking about all of the things we did. And it's like, what will they think of me if I divulge this information? So now we're back to the fig leaves and hiding and all that kind of stuff, man. But just to be free enough to say, man, I am messed up because of my looking at myself. And listen, it's not no news to God. Like our dear friend Charles says, you know, we're not messed up on the day we discover it. We were messed up before it. So my point is that God, we can't hide from him. So fall into his arms when you see yourself like that. Fall into him, man. Fall into him.
Absolutely.
Oh
Absolutely.
my goodness. This is great, man. This is great.
Let's get some comments now. Let's say what you all are hearing. And keep your comments succinct and keep it intelligent and keep it in line with the emphasis that we have here, right? Anyone?
Yeah, the emphasis. Let it stay consistent with the emphasis that is what is being spoken of here, because we're focusing on the flock and the movement of the flock, what is happening here, what God is doing with his people, those people that have been rejected. Let's see.
Let me give David the mic first. I think
okay. David there? Cool.
Let me give David the mic first. Yeah, David. I'm gonna turn the mic over to you first. Is he there?
He may not be available. I see his mic is not on. He may not be available right now.
Okay, anybody, man. Open up the line to anyone.
All right. Anyone with a comment regarding what we're talking about here? The mountain of the Lord's house. Well, that's for next time. But dealing with the sheep movement, the movement of the sheep, it just seems like God is turning his attention, which is where it's always been. And then when I looked at the history, oh my goodness, the history of the people back when Andy first started thinking about the issue of, man, God was underneath it, even though it was not spoken of or seen, he got underneath the cry of the masses. And man, I'm telling you, I mean, God is listening to the cry of his people, and he's going to answer. This word here is proof positive. God is going to rectify this thing and bring his original purpose and plan of the equipping of his people back to the forefront. And man, what a glorious day that's going to be. Let's hear some of your comments today about what was shared. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot to formulate. Sometimes when we don't originally have anything to really say ultimately, because we're thinking about these things and we're musing over them. So we understand that as well. But if you have any comments, something that struck you, something that opened up to you.
Kevin?
Yes.
Hi. I would like to say that in reflecting on everything that has been said today by Anderson, that going back to the Ephesians 4 mandate model is so key. That is where I'm most passionate. And this begins with leaders who are not intimidated by being surrounded by gifted people. And Anderson so eloquently said, and it's the heart of God, that we must be cognizant of our assignment to recognize that the saints are sacred. They are holy before God. And those who have been gifted to equip the saints must stay focused on that assignment to release them into their calling and their destiny. And that is the heart of God throughout this entire stream of conversation, is to equip the saints to fulfill the call that is upon their lives. The paradigm that's been sown, and of course, for centuries, the deception and the duping, the dumbing down is being consumed by the fire of God. And for this, I am grateful. It is about allowing, even the word as for those who haven't searched it out, the Nicolaitans, it's got to be burned up, that spirit. Even in the book of Revelation, Jesus said it so. I hate it. And it is what has caused the divide. And it's a gulf. It's been a great gulf. Those that are holding down the pews just need to be stirred and awakened, activated. That was another word. They must be activated to realize that they have a role, they have an assignment, they have a call, they have a destiny, and they must be released into it. We use the TEAR model. It's TEAR, teaching, equipping, activating, and releasing. TEAR. And that acronym helps you to remember why you are doing what you're doing.
Good. We have a couple more lines of it. Welcome your comment there, Levita. Let me ask who was it? Who's next? Hefziba. I think that is
Yes, Hefziba.
Hefziba. Yeah, don't mute your mic up. I think that's Lincoln. More than likely, that's Link. Link, you have to unmute your mic. Yeah, Mike. Yeah, Link.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Sorry about that. I didn't change the name on the frame. Listen, I have been, your presentation has been very powerful and confirmed so many things in my own heart. I have been looking at moving the people of our ministry, to be activated, to go out and do the work that God has called them to do. And I keep hearing voices around me. Well, we have to clean them up first. Now I know, that it was said by Jacob, and then we have to get rid of all the idols and this kind of thing, right? But how long do we wait for those things to happen? And we have ministries that are crying out. That people that we can trust in God and deal with the situations that as they arise in people's lives, because we may still have idols in our lives in various areas, but we still want to serve God. We want to give him that service out of our hearts, and to use the giftings that he's placed in us. We can't wait until we clean up everybody of everything before we release them. I don't think that's very practical. That is very possible, because as it's like a cabbage. As we more leaves we pull off, we more things we see at the bottom. Right? We keep pulling. So if the enemy could use that against us and say, well, they're killing people before you let them go, No. I said, hold on a minute. I'm not sure I clean up, but I thank God is using me. And I give him my heart, right? I give him my heart and I said, Lord, use me as best you can, right? And whenever anything comes up, I have to deal with it.
Right.
But there's this thought system that says, no, we have to clean them up totally before we can let them go, because they can't afford to make a mistake. I don't believe that. I think we can afford to make mistakes, and we clean it up. We clean it up.
Right.
In Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.
That point to make the link, and is in the presentation, I said that, listen, if God trusts me.
Yes, that's important. Link me up. Yeah, correct.
Why should I not trust others? You see, let me give you a little story here. And Mark, I think Mark is up next. I'm going to bleed into time a little bit. But when I got saved, I used to go to a church where a guy called Bertram Beard would have been like a mentor and a spiritual father to me. And I was saved just a couple of weeks, and this guy discovered something in my life that I had no idea that I had. As a matter of fact, he was almost like Eli to me, telling me that God is calling me when I had no knowledge that God was in fact calling me.
Right.
Not too long after that, I would say I was saved basically no more than about 6 weeks. And I traveled with this guy to New York in a large conference that he was doing. And if you know Bertrand, he was one of those kind of guys who almost like, he was like a loose cannon at times, but with good intentions. He goes to this large conference. I just accompanied him. And he goes to the microphone. He said, someone here tonight has a word for this conference. And he pointed to me. I had no idea. Now, I went there and I did the best I could. I felt as though the earth could open up and swallow me.
True.
But you know what was so amazing about this guy? He was the first person that came to me and he said, listen, the hand of God is upon you, young man. I'm so proud of you. So proud of you. And in so many areas where I was still so green, one of the reasons why I don't like being called apostle or reverend or doctor is because I was saved basically a couple of months when this guy asked me to become the associate of a large church. And I kept saying to him, listen, I am not worthy to be called any pastor because I don't even know what to do. I don't know what to do. And those are some of the reasons why I just don't even still like being called pastor or reverend or doctor. But Brother Bear, that's the term that we call him in Trinidad. He trusted me simply because of a grace he saw in me.
Yep.
And I'm convinced I didn't have the character. I wasn't mature, but a lot that God has done with me and continues to do with me, a lot of credit goes to him for to at least acknowledge something inside of me and giving me an opportunity to give expression to it. So yeah.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah, Mark, you're up next. Next, Mark and Becco. Long time I ain't talked to you, Mark. What's going on in Ghana, bro?
Yes, Andy, I'm good. Ghana is fine. A lot of or a number of scandals happening here in the political environment. It's getting interesting as next year, I think ending of next year, there should be elections.
Okay.
Lots happening. It's interesting, the things that you have thrown in. I jumped in late, but a couple of things strike a chord. Quite recently, I've been talking to the people around me about equipped for the work of ministry. And over the years, I've noticed in some environments, including my environment here, I've noticed that, sorry, let me position myself away from this. I've noticed that when people get an introduction to themselves, who they are in the mind of God, what they ought to do, what they ought to be, and that is being described or painted out by the gifts of God, whether in the fivefold ministry or in any capacity, as people will bring these graces or impartation into their lives and activate them. Many of these people take to flight because they will prefer a position where it is God bless you, God bless you, God bless you. I've had a case where I spoke in a community, and I knew after that meeting I would never be invited again because just when we were catching up, the pastor said, you know, my people, they like God bless you, God bless you. And I mean, blessing is what God started with from the very onset when man was created. But the point is that one of the challenges and one of the problems that many believers have plunged themselves into is not allowing themselves to step into their identity and to walk in the calling. That would allow the graces of God, whether being apostolic, prophet, evangelist, and all, to breathe out and bleed the capacity that God will want bleeded into these lives. And so the second thing I realized is that as I look through Ephesians chapter 4 and the word equipped, I come to the understanding that the individual graces, like the apostle, is supposed to relate his grace to the individual within the community, not just like a wholesale preaching, but it has to be some relational context that allow for that grace to build that unique person There are two mechanics, there are two engineers in that environment, there are two accountants, there are two different emerging prophets or apostles. But this apostle is supposed to relate his grace to them in the diverse, dynamic, intricately woven dimensions of their calling. But what we see is that we believe we can just throw in something, and some way, somehow, anyhow, the grace of God will find somebody, and somebody's activated, and then they find their way and all. I believe that this is a call for real. It is not for playing. It is not for playing church. It's not for playing. But that if we have to do this, then it must be done well. There's a company that says if it has to be done, then it must be done well. Thank you very much, Andy and everybody.
Oh, excellent, excellent, Mark. Good hearing your voice, Mark. It's been a while since I've spoken to you, and it's just good just to hear your voice. I mean, apart from the good
Yes, thank you, Andy.
I just want to say thanks for hearing your voice. Okay, let me get we have Brian from Kenya. What's happening, Brian, down in Kenya? What's going on?
Hey, Andy. Good evening, everybody. Good day.
And how is my nephew doing? I mean, what's going on with my nephews and all of them? They're all good?
He's good. He's good. Actually, his mother just put him down to sleep so that
Andy?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So actually, I have a contribution to make about the presentation. To me, it sounds more of a going back, a reset, where God is calling folks back to that Genesis 1 position, where he spoke to himself and said, okay, let us create man. So he is that ground, that background where man comes from. And he's sending folks out. But before he sends you out, he blesses you and then tells you be fruitful. Same thing that happened to Jacob, where God calls him and he changes his identity or shows him who he is and tells him the same thing. Be blessed, be fruitful, and multiply. Now, to be able to function in that is the same way we're seeing what happened with during the French Revolution. It's somewhat of an inward coming to self that causes a civil disobedience on the outside, a revolution of sorts, that our voice needs to be heard. But if you actually sit down and internalize, these folks actually came to themselves like, oh, this is who we are. This is our identity, and we need to be part of something. So that something is what, is what I'm seeing here in this whole presentation. And this is beautiful. This is beautiful, Andy. This is beautiful. Thank you for bringing it out.
Okay, I just love the way in which you were able to go back and connect the Genesis story, go back and connect the situation in France, the French Revolution. One of the things that Maximilian, who was one of the major voices in the French Revolution, his contemporary said, that's Maximilian Robespierre was his name. His contemporaries described him as the most dangerous man that was alive. For one reason, they said he believes exactly what he says. And this guy, Maximilian, was a lethal guy, a real thinker, and really brought massive changes to Europe. He was the brainchild behind the French Revolution. But he was one of those guys who kept insisting that the lower class must assume some level of privilege and status and not be treated as less than. But welcome your comment. Let me get yeah, David. I was calling out for you earlier. David Castro, mic is yours.
Yeah, I heard you call out. I didn't know it was me that you were calling out, but I'm glad I waited till now. What you shared today it's as Kelvin already said, it's powerful, but it has to be understood within the eternal purpose of God.
Right.
If I, as a leader or as a fivefold gift, hear the word equipping the saints for the work of ministry, and in my mind, I am convinced that ministry is this local church that I lead or this organization that I am a part of, then I'm going to equip the saints for the work of ministry within the scope of what I see is the Lord's work. I heard Lincoln say earlier, you know, to equip people into the Lord's work. I've been hearing that for 50 years, and we miss the mark. The key is we have to understand exactly what was the intent when Jesus established those gifts, the fivefold, and what does equipping the saints for the work of ministry. See, ministry is not a local church. Ministry is not a network. Ministry is not a denomination. The word ministry is to serve. And in the heart of Christ, thinking of the kingdom and of the Ekklesia that he was going to build, he's thinking of equipping saints that are going to impact in every sphere that they are in, wherever they're in the world. It has nothing to do with an organization or a system or what I believe is ministry. You know, you gave your example. Baird said to you, and by the way, I love Brother Baird. He was a great friend of mine, and I honor him and have great memories of him. But in his case, he saw in you what he discerned was your calling, and he stepped out boldly and called you on it. And you've been doing that ever since till today. That's what you've done today. But that's in your case. But everybody's not called to teach. Everybody's not called to prophesy. There are thousands of saints called to the ministry, whether they're doctors, attorneys, judges, mechanics, taxi drivers, wherever they're at. And it's our responsibility to equip them. I like the word to empower them, to know who they are in that sphere. We got to get out of this mindset that equipping the saints for ministry is something they're going to do in the church, or they're going to preach with a microphone, or they're going to be ushers, or they're going to be parking lot attendants, or they're going to be children's ministry. We got to get out of that mindset. So I believe what you have shared today is a cutting edge word, but we have to understand it within the eternal purpose of God, which is kingdom and Ekklesia.
Beautiful, beautiful. That was the reason why I was calling upon you, David, because I knew very well where you would aim your arrow, and it's just on point. Thank you very, very much. We have Winfred, but Winfred, before you come on, I'm seeing a couple of comments that are left on the chat, and it says here, when I hear, this is Cherry Lewis out of Trinidad, when I hear a word like this, I ask God to help me not to fall into the trap of looking outside of me. That is the position of beginning to feel that much of it is what I see in others. I need to move, and I like that because it's the element of personal responsibility. Personal responsibility. See, Anik Benjamin out of France is basically saying, please keep the interaction and the recording, that she has to send it out. Then she said, let it be done, less commentary. And I guess she's saying she wants more meta discourse and school approaches like that. Anik, okay, those are the few comments. Everything else there would be, I will translate this and transfer it. That's Anik again. Okay, let me jump back on and get, Winfred, the mic is yours, and you might be the last voice before Kelvin comes back on. So Kelvin, the mic is yours right after Winfred.
Hi, Adi. It's Henry.
Oh, Henry.
Yeah, it's Henry.
You're under Winfred, man. I don't know. I didn't need to call you sister or brother. For a while there, I was kind of confused, so I kept it generic.
Yes, we are under Winfred. Thank you. I also got in late, quite late in the presentation, but from where I got at the tail end, and then I asked myself, in looking at why Jesus came, he came not just to redeem us, but to recommission us back to the original assignment. And Jesus talking of John he says that of all men born of women, there's no greater than John. Then he adds and says, but he who is least in the kingdom is greater than he. Then the next thing is Hebrews 7. The Bible clearly says that Jesus was born not in the Levitical order, but in the Melchizedek order. Now, if you connect the two, you see here Jesus talking of John being born in the old order and announcing the coming of Christ. And he says he's the greatest because he became the bridge between the two. But again, he says he's the least. Even the least in the kingdom is greater than he. That means he's telling us, get out of the old order and get into the new order that Christ came to reestablish. And why? Because his coming was to recommission us back, and not just redemption, but recommissioning us back to the assignment that is actually in Genesis. And then he goes ahead and talking to Peter, asking Peter, who do men say that I am? And he says, you are the Christ, you are this, you are this. But then he asks him, you whom do you say that I am? And then he tells him, upon that truth, I will build my Ekklesia. You see, if you connect the three, you see one thing Jesus is telling us, get out of the old order with its religiousness and all that, which is full of ritual, because you cannot enter the kingdom with those rituals and the traditions of elders that are actually a hindrance to the purposes of God. And that is why he tells Peter, now that you have known the truth, you are part of the setting. I'm going now to establish my Ekklesia. And this is the purpose for which I came to reestablish that the kingdom and the Ekklesia. And then now he brings that clarity, and we get that clarity when he's saying we cannot do this when we are in the old order. And that's why he's telling us we have to get out of the old order, get into this new order in the kingdom, away from the religious practices and rituals of men, and get into the order that he came in. Which is this order that he came in? The Melchizedek order of getting the instructions. You get the instructions and execute them away from these rituals, the traditions of the orders. Those were just stopgap measures. They are not in the new order.
Excellent.
So that becomes the way we should be moving on. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Excellent, Henry. I'm going to turn the mic over to Kelvin. So Kelvin, mic is yours, bro.
All right. Andy, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Levita Williams says ministry should occur whenever we appear. Ministry should occur whenever we appear. That's from Levita Williams. And so with that, everyone, we're going to bid you farewell for this week. Thank you so much for our audience in attendance. And those of you that listen by recording, it will be coming forth quite shortly. So thank you very much. Good day, all.